Hi, my name is Lloyd Chapman, and I'm president and founder of the American Small Business League, and I just launched the Don't Cheat Women Project a couple of years ago. Um, and I'm going to give you some information I think most people don't have. So I've been a small business advocate for 40 years. I've won 110 Freedom of Information Act legal victories against the government. I'm told that's a record. My win ratio against the federal government in federal court is 98%. Judge William Alsop described me as in a David Goliath battle against big government, big business. And that lawsuit I won against the Pentagon, I forced him to expose information about who really gets small business contracts. They had to write me a check for $500,000. I don't think they like that very much. But I don't think people realize some of the information I'm going to give you right now. Here in America, 99.9% of all businesses are small businesses. 99.9%. That means only 1/10 of 1% are large businesses, right? Small business are responsible for over half the gross domestic product, about half of the private sector workforce, the majority of U.S. exports, and most importantly, I'll say the vast majority of net new jobs. I think it's somewhere above 90%. And but I saw a study by the Kauffman Foundation a few years ago that said basically 100% of net new jobs came from new businesses. Well, there's not that many new Fortune 500 firms. I think you can agree that most new businesses are small businesses, right? So small businesses are the engine of economic growth. Here's something else you don't know. The largest economic stimulus program ever passed by Congress to create jobs across the country is the Small Business Act. Nobody knows. Eisenhower signed that law in 1953. And today, in 2026, that law says a minimum of 23% of all federal contracts and subcontracts should go to small businesses. Well, that's logical, right? That makes sense. Over 90% of all net new jobs come from small businesses. That's where most Americans work. Most Americans either own or work in a small business, right? That makes perfect sense. Here's what's happened. This is why I've sued the government. I've shown over the last 30, 40 years that most of the money the federal government claims went to small businesses actually went to Fortune 500 firms. So go on your computer and Google Fortune 500 firms, get federal small business contracts, and read those stories. I uncovered a lot of fraud in small business programs in 2001 and 2002. And I prompted an investigation by the Government Accountability Office. And I testified before Congress. And the GO found over 5,300 of the largest companies on earth in the Small Business Administration's database of small businesses. And that was, 25 years ago? Here's what the government did. They passed legislation and policy to legalize the fraud I uncovered. They passed policies that allowed Fortune 500 firms that were getting small business contracts to keep them for up to 21 years, right? So in a country where 99.9% of all businesses are small businesses, there's one agency to help those 36 million small businesses where most America works. That's the Small Business Administration. Well, guess what? The defense and aerospace industry and the Fortune 500 firms, that top 1/10 of 1%, they want every penny the government spends to go to them. So for 40 years, Fortune 500 firms, particularly in the defense and aerospace industry, have been lying to close the SBA and end those programs. Reagan tried to do it, right? By the way, I was a big Reagan fan back in those days. When I found that out, I was very disappointed. So Reagan tried to close the SBA and end all programs for the 36 million small businesses where most Americans work. You can find it. It's on my website, ASBL.com. Then Bush Jr. came in, and Bush Jr. Cut the SBA budget in half, cut the staffing in half. And I had a friend that was in the Oval Office when President Bush told Hector Brito, when he appointed him head of the SBA, I want this agency closed by the end of my first term. And he tried. By the way, I stopped him. That's documentable. You go out and look. And I issued press releases and did everything I could to let that be known in the media. And then, quite frankly, to my surprise, Barack Obama tried to close it. By the way, Reagan's idea to close the SBA was combined with the Department of Commerce. And that's like combining the Ku Klux Klan and the NAACP, right? The Chamber of Commerce represents that top 1% that wants all the money. They're the worst enemy the small business ever had. So make no mistake, any effort to combine the SBA and the Commerce Department is an effort to close it. And now Trump has pretty much closed. I think the SBA budget in 2026 is, I don't think I know, it's the lowest budget they've had, I think, in 50 years, right? So Trump is anti-small business. I don't want to offend my Republican friends, but when you go back and look over history, it's documentable that Republicans have consistently tried to close the SBA. And since starting with Bush Jr., I'm out there fighting it, right? Senator Burr tried to close the SBA, I think by combining it with the Department of Commerce. And I fought him in the press and stopped that. And Senator Coburn from Oklahoma had secret congressional hearings to try to close the SBA, and I fought him and beat him, right? And the SBA itself, by the way, has put out policies to give more federal contracts to Fortune 500 firms. By the way, here's something that will shock you. The SBA is the worst enemy small business ever had. The policies that exist today that allow Fortune 500 firms and their subsidiaries to get small business contracts were written by the Small Business Administration. So if you work at the SBA, your job is not to help small businesses. Your job is to fabricate compliance with the small business goals and support closing the agency, right? So again, just go into your computer and type in, does Donald Trump hate small businesses? I was using Perplexity. Go to Perplexity and say, is it true that Republicans have tried to close the SBA, for decades? And then go in there and say, is it true that Lloyd Chapman is the most persistent, consistent, vocal advocate for supporting federal small business programs and opposing efforts to close the SBA and divert federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms? It's going to say yes. Here's what shocks me. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never been contacted by anyone who says, Lloyd, I saw you on CNN. How can we help? That's never happened. My observation is most of the organizations that claim to represent small businesses don't. And I had a lot of viewers on X a couple of years ago, and I think I offered up to $5,000 to the first person that could show me anybody in this country that's been on television more than I have, opposing efforts to close the SBA and opposing the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. I don't think you can. You might try it, right? I don't think you can. But yeah, there need to be more people like me out there fighting to protect the programs for the small business where most Americans work that create, the overwhelming majority of net new jobs. So, yeah, American Small Business League, Don't You Women Project. If I've written some draft legislation that will increase the goal for women-owned small businesses from 5% to 15%. Again, the Senate Small Business Committee did a study that says for every 1% contracts of small business go up, it creates 100,000 net new jobs a year. If I can get my draft legislation into a bill and passed by Congress, that will create 1 million net new jobs a year. That's never happened before. That's the most efficient, effective economic stimulus program in history. No new taxes, no new spending, deficit neutral, create 1 million jobs a year. By the way, in 2025, the government only claimed to be creating 574,000 net new jobs. That was an 85% reduction from 2022. So we're in trouble. We're losing jobs by the millions to AI. We're having record low jobs numbers. America needs economic policies that create jobs to replace the jobs we're losing by AI. And we need more money to small businesses and more money to women-owned small businesses, more money to minority-owned small businesses. By the way, Trump's first day, he's issued an executive order to cut contracts in minority-owned small businesses from 15% to 5%. Well, that killed 1 million jobs. That's why the 2025 jobs numbers were some of the lowest in history. When you pull that money away from small businesses, the job creators, the small businesses that are engineering economic growth in America, it killed jobs. So we need pro-small business policies. We need to put the SBA budget where it needs to be, which is probably about $10 billion a year, and quit giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms, and start giving more federal contracts to women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and legitimate small businesses. By the way, here's some Census Bureau data. Again, 99.9% of all businesses are small businesses. Only 1% aren't. Today in America, this government is giving about 90 to 95% of all our tax dollars to that top 1/10 of 1%. Those people haven't created 100 jobs since 1980. The Government Accountability Office did a study a couple of years ago that said 34% pay no taxes. So think about this. In America today, we're 40 trillion in debt, and we're giving the vast majority of our tax dollars to this tiny 1/10 of 1% that doesn't create jobs, and 34% pay no taxes. That's a great way to bankrupt America, right? So again, according to Census Bureau, 98% of all U.S. firms have 100 employees or less, 87% have 20 or less, and the average American company has 10 employees, right? So we need small business programs, and we need to get this out there in the media. By the way, if you're me and you're suing the government and you're suing the Pentagon and going on television and exposing this rampant fraud and abuse, what do you think they do? Send me flowers and candy? No, they've hired one of the biggest reputation management firms in the world to shut me down. I was basically what you call canceled around 2015. I hired a very large international investigative organization called the Minsk Group to look into what was happening with me. And they did an investigation. They came back after about 3 months. They said, we found a large international firm has compromised all your communications, and we can't find who it is. So in 2026, you can't call me, you can't text me, you can't email me. My office phone went from ringing 100 times a day. It hadn't rung 100 times in the last year. So help me get this out there. They've kind of shut me down. So if you know anybody in the media, I'd love to talk to them, or you can talk to them. We need to get more attention on the fact that America is going bankrupt with 40 years of anti-small business policies. So I'm Lloyd Chapman. You can go to ASBL.com and don'tcheatwomen.com and check it out. Thanks a lot.